The proceeding will start shortly.
Welcome to today's session, which is on screen time, impacts on education and wellbeing. And we are first of all taking oral evidence from Mark Bunting, the Director of Online Safety Strategy and Delivery at Ofcom, and Yih-Choung, the Group Director for Strategy and Research at Ofcom. You're both very welcome. Thank you for giving evidence to us today. First question, does the Online Safety Act provide you with enough powers to keep children safe online?
Thank you, Chairman, and good morning, Committee. The Online Safety Act does give us extensive powers to hold services to account for keeping their users safe. There's a lot of focus on our enforcement powers to levy fines and so on. But actually, I think more important, particularly at this point, early in the implementation of the Act, are our powers to provide codes of practice, which must set out steps that companies can take to comply with their duties, and our powers to request information, where we have enforceable rights to require companies to provide information to us that we can use to assess their compliance with the Act. So we are confident. It's a new regime. We're really in the implementation of it, but we think the Act sets out a strong suite of powers.
And over the coming years, would you want further powers to be granted in unregulated areas such as artificial intelligence?
Well, I might start by observing that AI is not completely unregulated. For example, in general, our existing regulatory frameworks, including the Broadcasting Code, including the Online Safety Act, are focused on the services that people use rather than focusing on the specific underlying technology. So that already gives us powers to regulate AI when it's used as part of those services. And since the Online Safety Act is essentially a technologically neutral regime, I think it captures risks associated with emerging forms of AI. To give you an example, if a user creates content with a generative AI tool, but then uploads that to a service regulated under the Online Safety Act, then it is the responsibility of that service to make sure that content which is illegal or that is harmful to children is suitably dealt with. So in that sense, it captures AI-generated porn or non-consensual intimate content.
It's interesting. I mean, you talk about it as being sort of technologically neutral. We've heard quite a lot of evidence during the course of this inquiry about concerns about the difference between the rules for broadcast and online content. Do you think that's a sustainable position, that there are those distinctions between what is legal to broadcast through traditional broadcast media and what is legal to put online?
I think that's a very important issue, and as I said, the Online Safety Act, we have the benefit of it having been discussed by Parliament and it being more technologically neutral. The Broadcasting Act, as you will be very aware, there are amendments that are being discussed at the moment in terms of a media bill which will ensure that it keeps up to date with viewing, which is increasingly moving online. So there are some areas for development there which are important.
Thank you. I'll bring in Flick.
Yeah, that sort of leads us on. I mean, are you satisfied with the level of engagement that social media companies and tech companies on the changes? Are they engaging with you, and are you happy that they are doing what they're supposed to be doing?
Yeah, so I think we've been really clear that we expect change. We don't think that many services at all, if indeed any, are taking all the steps that we've set out already in our initial codes of practice for illegal harms. We have engaged extensively with industry over the last few years, not just since the Act passed, but in the preparation of the legislation. And we have been regulating video sharing platforms based in the UK for a number of years already. I think we've been pleased so far with the constructive engagement, but of course the proof of the pudding will come when we are seeking to ensure that the prompt action is being taken. And in some areas we have taken enforcement action already. So I mentioned the video sharing platform regulation. We've brought a number of actions there to ensure that adult VSPs using age assurance to keep their content away from children. So again, it's that we want to bring services into compliance through constructive engagement where we can, but we do have those enforcement powers to back them up when we need to. So far, I would say, since passage of the Act, overall we've been pleased with the constructive response we've had.
And do you think there's enough ability for people to complain? There's a complaints process that is easily identifiable for people who need to?
Well, it's one of the areas where we have made proposals in the work that we've already done, and particularly relevant, I think, to this committee. It's going to be an area that we focus on again in our forthcoming consultation on protection of children online, because, of course, even complaint systems that might be navigable for adults are not always suitable for younger users. So that is going to be an area of focus for us. And I think there's two parts to it. I think one part is, as you say, are the complaints mechanisms accessible and easy to use? And we've provided some guidance already on what that might look like for services. Then, of course, there's what's the response that users get when they have used those complaints mechanisms. And we've made some recommendations there about services being better at acknowledging complaints and setting out what steps they will take to assess those complaints. So it's an area for improvement, I would say, in the industry.
Thank you. Could I just ask two follow-up questions on that? Firstly, in terms of, you mentioned you've already taken a number of enforcement measures. Do you publish on a rolling basis where those, how many have been issued and in what context?
We do publish a regular enforcement bulletin, and that includes details of cases that have been through the enforcement process. We published one last week. Very happy to share details of that with the committee. Of course, what we try to achieve is compliance before getting to the enforcement stage, and that won't always be a public process because our focus is on getting the right outcome for users. But where we have taken things through investigations, then yes, we are transparent about that.
And in terms of the consultation you mentioned, specifically aimed at protection of children, what's the timing of that?
That's going to come out in the spring. So only 2 or 3 months away now, and that will build on the work that we've set out in the illegal harms consultation, but obviously we'll be taking some areas further in light of the particular risks to children.
Okay, thank you. I'll bring in Anna.
Thank you, Chair. We have certainly covered a little bit of this. So Ofcom's projected that full implementation of the Online Safety Act will not be completed until next year. So how are you working with the government, with social media companies, with parents, to ensure children are protected in the meantime?
Yeah. Well, it is a complex piece of legislation, and as you say, the roadmap that we've set out envisages that it will be implemented over a series of phases. That's very much driven by the approach that the Act took to different duties applying to different types of harm. We have sought to move as quickly as we could after the Act passed to bring forward proposals on illegal harms. But we will, of course, need to consult on those carefully. We're in the course of doing that now. The consultation closed just a week or two ago, and we'll need to consider carefully the responses that we get. So there is a process that's involved there to put the formal building blocks of the regulation in place that will take some time. What we're doing in the meantime, I would say there are 2 or 3 things. So firstly, we are doing a lot to talk to children and parents about their experiences of online harm and their expectations of the new rules. We've spoken to thousands of children already. Again, we'll be publishing more of that information with the consultation that we're due to publish in May. We're also developing plans for more systematic ways of engaging children in the work that we're doing so that we have ready access to that voice of the child throughout our policy-making process. We also work very closely with civil society. There's a lot for us to do to explain the Act to civil society organisations and to enable them to participate fully in the policy-making process. But we've had probably several hundred meetings over the last few months with civil society organisations to try to ensure that we understand those perspectives and that we're reflecting them where we can in our work.
And if I can just build on Mark's answer there, so part of that work with civil society and others is part of our media literacy programme. I know you've taken evidence from the likes of Internet Matters and Parent Zone, but we're working very closely with organisations like that. And indeed, very shortly, we will be publishing research on children's online experiences, which will include cyberbullying, violent content, suicide, self-harm, and eating disorders. And as Mark said, of course, we are getting on with our video sharing platform regime, and there are 2 cases that we completed, published on Friday, platforms so spoilt and expanded, where they will now take on age assurance duties as a result of the concerns we've raised.
Excellent. So, but on Internet Safety Day this year, some of us heard from parents who have real worries about extreme breathing challenges on the internet, on the TikTok platform, and they've contacted Ofgem about these and not even received a reply. Is that something that's fallen through the net? Is that what you would, or how should they be engaging with you, and what are you trying to do at the moment?
Yeah. So we do have means for individuals to contact us. In these regimes, we're not empowered to adjudicate on individual complaints about whether particular items of content should be removed or not, but we do have tools for people to notify us of those sorts of issues. I'm sorry to hear that those individuals hadn't had a response. I'm very happy to look at those individual cases if that would be useful, but we do try to acknowledge everything that we come in. I mean, we do have to be clear that doesn't necessarily mean that we can immediately get on the phone to the company and require them to take things down, but we can use that as evidence for the engagement that we have with firms. And TikTok, we do talk to them regularly. They're one of the services that is regulated under the video sharing platform regulation. We've talked to them a lot about the tools that they have to keep users safe. That's an ongoing process. They're making commitments to us about the information that they can share about how they're seeking to improve their protections, and that's a dialogue which is ongoing at the moment. And I can't say much more about it, but it is an issue that we're engaging with them on. You
would recognise that extreme breathing challenges aimed at children on TikTok shouldn't be there.
I'm not familiar with those particular cases, but clearly what we're concerned to do is to ensure that services are using the right measures to try to prevent harmful content from reaching children. And of course that won't be a perfect science, and as I say, we're very interested to hear evidence that parents might have about where things are going wrong.
Thank you. I'll take that up afterwards. Are there any further delays expected by Ofcom in implementing the Act?
No. We've set out the roadmap that we published in October. As you quite rightly said earlier, that has a number of phases which in total we expect to take about 18 months to put in place. Some parts are coming earlier, so we're aiming to submit our final codes of practice on illegal harms to the Secretary of State around the end of this year, and they'll then be laid before Parliament. After which time they'll be in force. So some parts will come earlier. We're not currently expecting any delays to the roadmap that we published last year.
Thank you.
Just ask, in terms of your guidance on illegal harms, I mean, I think Anna's point as well about these extreme breathing challenges is one example of where something can suddenly pop up and become a thing. And it's not necessarily going to be a consistent list of things which are harmful content online. These things will develop over time. How flexible is your approach to be able to take account of things which might suddenly become a fad, might suddenly emerge as a risk that haven't necessarily been thought about previously?
So I think this is a really important class of risk. If I look at the research, then 71% of secondary school children say that they have seen harmful content in the previous 4 weeks. And top of that list, actually, about 30% of that is social media challenges, which, as you described, can be really, really dangerous. Why is that? Well, I think that's in part about how viral content works and how the content recommendation engines will then feed those and perpetuate that kind of viral content. Those are issues that fall within for the harms that are identified in the Online Safety Act. So that is very much an area where we are focusing with platforms.
Yeah, absolutely. And in the illegal harms proposals that you mentioned, we've recommended that services that use recommender algorithms should do tests to check that those recommender algorithms aren't promoting illegal content to users. Of course, illegal content under the Act shouldn't be present at all, but there's clearly a risk that sometimes it will arise, and we want services to take steps to make sure that they're then not aggravating that by the way that their recommender algorithms work. That will be even more important in the protection of children work that we publish in the spring, because of course in that area that's not content that is illegal, and therefore services may choose that they want to carry content that is inappropriate for children. What we need to make sure is that they're then taking steps to ensure that children aren't generally exposed to that type of content. And those tests on recommender systems will be a really important part of that.
Yeah, we've received other evidence from people who've sent into us describing Ofcom's consultation process as technical and long. How are you ensuring that children and parents can engage with that consultation process?
Yeah, so as I said earlier, it is unavoidable. We do have to publish a great deal of detail to substantiate the proposals that we're making, and that does result in admittedly very large quantities of material being published, and I completely appreciate that's intimidating and hard to engage with, not only for individual users but potentially for a wide range of stakeholders. We have tried to make things simpler, so we've published a summary of the approach. We've published summaries of each of the sets of measures that we're recommending services take. We've also provided tools on our website to help people navigate the consultation and dive into the areas that are of particular concern to them. I think it is an area where we can do more. As I said earlier,
well, please do.
Yes. We have done a lot to talk to younger users in the course of developing our proposals. That's going to be a continued focus for us. I'm not sure that formal consultations will ever be the best way of children and parents telling us what they think, but we are committed to continuing to do that. We spend a lot of money on the surveys that we do for children and parents, and we'll be looking to build on that.
If I can say specifically on that point, so ahead of our protection of children consultations that Mark has referred to, we have a series of focused discussions that we are planning with children so that we can create a safe space to build their knowledge and understanding of what the regime is meant to do, but then of course listen and get a sense from their real lived experiences of how that should shape what we are doing.
I mean, I think the thing is, from my perspective, is at the end of this, there are real people out there, and there are real consequences when things go wrong, and it's just a question of what can we do to make sure that anything that we can do from a technical perspective has that in focus and that in mind, that there are real implications for real people, particularly children, young people. If we don't get this right. Yeah. It seems to me that you've got a sort of a key role in making sure that it does become right or better than it certainly is at the moment.
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree, and hearing the personal testimony of people who've been who have experienced online harms is always very, very powerful, and we've all seen the tragic cases that have arisen when things go wrong. I think it's absolutely central to our job that we put the outcomes that we're trying to achieve for users right at the start of our process. And I think it's a fair challenge to say that sometimes that can be lost in informal consultation processes. But if I think about the things that we've aimed to achieve in the work that we've done so far, making sure that children aren't exposed to sexual exploitation and abuse online, absolutely at the heart of the proposals that we made. about distribution of child sex abuse images and steps to prevent grooming in the consultation that we've already published, and looking ahead, ensuring that children aren't being recommended content on topics like suicide and self-harm and eating disorder content.
Just violence in general, I mean, just think violence in general is a real online harm, and having access to violent material can have real sort of detrimental psychological impacts for young people.
Yeah, we're very aware of that, particularly actually in the context of pornography, which I know the committee has spent some time on previously. And one of the many reasons that we're concerned about online pornography is that, of course, it can stray well beyond the bounds of what would be acceptable in other media into violence and extreme forms of pornography. And I think the impacts of that on children are quite well documented, and it's not the sort of relatively sort of market-friendly end of the pornography spectrum. It can be very, very harmful and damaging, and that's absolutely at the heart of our proposals.
And on that point, I mean, one of the people who's given us very strong evidence on that is the Office of the Children's Commissioner. Are you working through the Office of the Children's Commissioner in terms of your youth consultation and in terms of reaching out? Because it strikes me she's well placed to coordinate some of that youth voice.
Yeah, we have had a number of engagements with the Children's Commissioner, and she and a number of children's charities wrote to us quite some time ago now, and we took forward a number of their proposals in the work that we've published and will be publishing in the spring. So yes, that is really important relationship for us, and we'll be keen to build on that further as we come to implement the protections.
Andrew.
Thank you, Robin. So France is aiming to introduce some strict age verification measures in an attempt to address the large numbers of users on social media. Do you think the UK should be adopting that approach? And just, that's a bit obvious, but just to add to that, just do you draw a distinction between messaging services and wider social media providers? Because the area where it seems that the greatest dissonance between people in rooms like this and people in regulatory bodies saying, oh yes, we must do something about this, and reality is WhatsApp, where every child is on WhatsApp, and I'm not sure how they would feel that they would cope if they were the only child in their class or group who wasn't on WhatsApp. But that's a messaging service primarily rather than social media. So is there some attempt, not only in terms of the French model of stricter age verification, but also to draw some distinctions within what's available? Yeah,
so just to tease apart the different strands of that, of course, within age verification, and I think there's two aspects to that, and the first, of course, is age verification at the 18 boundary between children and adults, and that's an area where the Act is very clear, and we've been very clear in the proposals that we set out before Christmas that services that allow pornography and other types of restricted content for adults must have highly effective means of distinguishing between over and under 18s. But I think you're also referring to enforcement of social media companies' lower age limits, which tend to be 13. There's some variety between them. And on that one, so we do know from our own research, of course, no surprise, that there are a lot of under 13s who are using services, whether it's social media or messaging services. I think that is a concern. Our immediate priority will be trying to make services safe for all child users. So there's nothing very magical about the boundary at 13, and if a service is safe for a 13-year-old, then that will help ensure that it's safe for under 13s who are there when they shouldn't be. So that, if you like, is the sort of immediate priority for us, is making that focus on child safety front and centre for firms. In terms of the distinction between social media and private messaging, I think the way that I would think about that is that we have already and will continue to recommend different steps that different types of service should take. So for social media, our focus will be on the nature of the content that's available, and the way that recommender algorithms might be promoting that content to child users. For messaging services, it's actually a bit less about the content, and it's more about ensuring that they can't be contacted by people who may wish them harm. Of course, there are harms that can arise in groups of children as well, but our primary focus initially is trying to ensure that adults can't approach children they don't know on messaging services.
That's very helpful, thank you, and constructive, thoughtful. So we talked about France, but is there any other international examples to online safety that you've looked at and you think are worthwhile? And are you able to draw a distinction between best practice meaning more, best practice means more regulations and stricter regulations, or smarter regulations and more sophisticated approaches that have the desired effect but aren't just enabling others to say we've done something because we've passed an encyclopedia full of rules that then no one ever follows?
Those are very good questions. I think actually the UK online safety regime is amongst the first in the world. So in many respects, I think we find ourselves at the frontier or leading in some cases. However, the services that we are looking to regulate are, of course, global in nature. And so international engagement is absolutely core to what we do and to our success. I think that's partly about the need to build consistency so that you have scale, which then drives better incentives in terms of compliance for the companies that are involved. So specifically, in 2022, we co-founded the Global Online Safety Regulators Network. So that is together now with other countries, including Australia, Ireland, France, South Africa, South Korea. So a genuinely global opportunity to share best practice, as you say. We have other mechanisms as well. So, for example, there is an informal international working group on age verification that we participate in with a number of other European countries to ensure that video sharing platforms have robust access controls in place to protect children. To your second question, in terms of best practice, yes, I think it is not necessarily about more. There are trade-offs that are important here. There are benefits from innovation of new services, which we care about, and of course freedom of expression that we want to protect. But a lot of the international collaboration we do is about trying to drive smarter regulation, as you say, and best practice. To give you an example, it's an area where we've been working hard in terms of media literacy. So, for example, as part of that Global Online Safety Regulators Network I mentioned, we have a education and awareness working group, and as part of that we've shared our best practice of media literacy by design for platforms. So this is where we're encouraging the platforms themselves to put in place by design better safety measures, so making it easier for users to alert and tag content which they think is harmful. Or we put together a media literacy toolkit last year for evaluating interventions. So essentially what works and what doesn't work, can we kind of share that and help others? And the French regulator Ofcom has translated that into French and is making use of that. I was very pleased that last year UNESCO recognised our work on media literacy with underserved communities, working in local communities with the likes of mental health organisations for neurodiverse, and we were awarded a second place in their global media literacy awards last year. So there's a number of things we're trying to contribute to build this international coalition where we can be smarter about the regulation, not just put forward a greater volume.
Who got first place?
That is an excellent question. I will need to check.
Great, thank you, Chairman.
You just eradicated that from your memory.
That is interesting. Just one of our colleagues who's not here today has been asking about the issue of devices, and isn't one of the ways in which we should be looking at this through access to devices. Do you have any views on that as to how realistic and workable that would be? What has been proposed is that children under a certain age, say 16, should only be allowed to take out devices that are either not internet enabled or have parental controls installed by default. would you see that as a workable approach?
Shall I take that one?
Go on.
Thank you. So, look, I think the campaigns that Esther Jai and others have been developing in this area are very thoughtful and thought-provoking. In the end, a matter like that is one for governments, not for the regulator. And, of course, we're willing to support Parliament and government in any considerations that it might have. I think... what we do know is that families and children do attach a great deal of value and get a lot of benefit from the services that they use online, and our research shows that very closely. We think there's a lot we can do to make the experience for children safer on the devices that they're using. There may be broader considerations, including the screen time considerations that the inquiry is working on here, but in terms of that online safety angle, we feel there's a lot that we can do to help make the online experience safer for children, so that where they are using those devices, they can be confident that they'll be protected.
And just you mentioned earlier that among your powers, you have powers to compel data from organisations. We've heard, obviously, during the course of the inquiry, a number of cases where, talking of the importance of parents and families, parents have wanted to get data but haven't been able to, and have struggled to get data as to what children have seen online. Mm-hmm. Is that something that you, as the regulator, when the Act is fully implemented, will be able to help with?
Yes, there are new powers in the Act we can, following a request from a coroner, we can require services to provide data that they hold about the use of a service by a child. Those powers are coming into force shortly. We're working very closely with the Chief Coroner and the coroners to ensure that coroners understand when they can use those powers and what they can be used for. There's also an ongoing debate, I believe, in the context of the data protection legislation that's going through government at the moment, which might build on those powers. So, yes, that will make a difference. Of course, we all hope that we don't have to use those powers because they only relate specifically to the death of a child. But in that instance, which has been the cause of considerable concern to coroners and to families in the past, the Act will give us new powers to take action.
But to be clear, therefore, unless that bar has been met and unless a coroner's inquiry has been triggered, there is no means for parents to request the regulator access data.
That's correct, yeah.
Thank you. I think that concludes this session. I know the Minister has been patiently waiting, so we will bring him on. Thank you for your evidence today.
Thank you.
The proceeding is currently suspended. 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 The proceeding is currently suspended.
It's been a long week since we last saw you. So we have the Right Honourable Damian Hinds MP, Minister of State for Schools at the Department for Education, Charlotte Briscall, Director and Chief Digital Officer for the Department for Education, and Kate Dixon, Director of Pupil, Wellbeing and Safety at the Department for Education. You're all very welcome. Minister, if I can start by asking, the Department has previously described evidence on the effect of screen time on children as mixed. But our inquiry has heard a huge amount of evidence on its negative effects and the risks. We were quite struck in our meetings with UNESCO that they had moved from a position where they were sort of pushing digital education to one where they seem to be beginning to sound some alarm bells and talking about the limitations and the risks as well. How concerned are you at the cumulative effect of screen time on children and young people?
Well, I think it's right for all of us to be concerned and to be very conscious and to keep looking at this, and obviously that has a particular relevance in education, but there are a wider set of considerations, of course, as well. You mentioned that we had said that the evidence is inconclusive. It's not only us that says that. That is a wide, much quoted, much repeated thing. I think part of the reason for that, quite a big part of the reason, is that it isn't one thing. So you cannot, say this amount of screen time is good and anything greater is bad, because it totally depends what you are doing. Not totally. It depends to a large extent what you are doing with that screen time. So even relatively small amounts of viewing, consuming harmful content, or engaging in harmful activity, or being exposed to other, even small amounts of that is bad for you and just bad. If you're engaging in pro-social activity, learning activity, that's obviously very different. So I think it is because you cannot disentangle totally the full range of things that screen time involves. I think it is difficult to talk about sort of benchmark levels. That said, there are some things we do know. So the OECD, among others, has used its research, PISA research, for example, to establish, if you look at screen time, time online, whether for leisure purposes or for educational purposes, there is they use the phrase the Goldilocks effect. I think it. I'm not sure I think that phrase may have come from some original. Yeah. Originally, obviously we know where it comes from, but I think in this context it may have come from an earlier academic study. But that if you track, internet use against mathematics attainment, for example, obviously that's not the only thing to track against, but it's one thing that's is pretty easy to quantify. You see a curve that goes kind of like that, and then like that. So the Goldilocks effect is, not too much, not too little. There seems to be some positive effect from relatively small amounts. I haven't got the graph in front, about an hour. But then it comes after sort of 1 to 2 hours, then it comes down and is having a negative effect. There's an earlier OECD study. So from it was the 2015 PISA cycle, so reported in 2017, which then looked at relationships between, I think the phrase they use is extreme internet use, and various kind of measures of happiness. And unsurprisingly, I think probably to everybody, when you look at extreme use, that tends to be associated with unhappiness. I think in almost every country studied, I think actually with one exception, although a couple of big countries weren't involved. So it's quite a long answer, but it's quite a big question.
It is a big question.
It's a big question.
And in fairness, I think what you said chimes with a lot of what we heard from the academic experts in terms of different types of screen time and so on and so forth. I guess what we are concerned about here is partly the cumulative impact and partly the fact that all of these pieces of research take a long time to produce. They tend to be based on data from some time ago, and in the meantime, everybody is carrying around access to the internet and digital devices. Right. 1 in 5 children in the UK aged 3 to 4 have their own mobile phone. At age 8, this rises to 1 in 4. Does the department have a view, or is it forming a view as to actually at what age is it healthy for children to have a smartphone? I was quite struck. We visited a school yesterday as part of this inquiry to look at their use of the Yonder devices to control mobile phone use. They were saying a small minority of their Year 7 girls didn't have phones. And certainly it has become very, very normal for primary age children to have phones. Is that safe, reasonable, given what we've just been hearing from Ofcom about the number of children under the age of 13 who are accessing social media, which they're not legally or supposed to be doing? Is it perhaps time to be having more of a debate around that?
It's definitely good to have a debate about it, Chairman. You're right. I mean, almost close to everybody gets a mobile phone now, at least between year 6 and year 7. There seems to be, and I think Ofcom have reported on this in the past, and others, there seems to be something of a rite of passage about that. But you're also right, some children will get a phone or a smartphone quite a lot earlier. We don't say, the government doesn't tell parents when is the appropriate time to do that. These are decisions for families. They're decisions for parents in bringing up their children. But I do, just to be clear, I do welcome the debate around this, and I think having it in the public sphere, having commentators, journalists, academics, and politicians talking about it, I think is helpful. You mentioned, I'm going to try and make my subsequent answer shorter, but these are very, very big, very expansive topics that we're opening on. You mentioned earlier the point around, all the research is always a bit old, and so on. That is true. Actually, an awful lot of the research on social media relates to Facebook, because it was the most easily accessible data set, and that is all but irrelevant to today. To most of the people we're talking about today, and there is a danger that by the time you get the results of the full-scale trial or experiment or analysis, the world has just moved on, and so I think a precautionary approach is wise, and I think a lot of people in society would agree with that. I would say intuitively, of course, we should be careful about these things.
And just, to your point that this is not something you should specify, one point which has been raised with me, and I appreciate this isn't really within your brief, although it touches on it, is the early years foundation stage does include an element on digital. I've talked to a number of nursery leaders and early years practitioners who said, we deliberately do not do that because we know that they will be getting it at home. And I just wonder if that needs reviewing. If there is content there that the practitioners feel isn't appropriate for them to be doing, because they know the children are getting that exposure to digital at home, maybe we should be saying, actually take that out of the curriculum for the early years foundation stage, because you don't need to be building digital literacy for 2 and 3 year olds. Surely we ought to be trying to limit the amount of screen time cumulatively that they're receiving.
So look, even more generally than that, I think it's true to say that for children of all ages now, there's a limit to the extent to which it is necessary to introduce children to technology. Quite often the challenge is the reverse. You're right, though, that the early years foundation stage is not my portfolio. It would be wrong of me to comment in detail. But what we can say is that the very earliest years are the one part of the of childhood where there is internationally stronger analysis and so on, and a WHO recommendation which I think does not exist for older children at a sort of WHO level, on not having none, by the way, because there can be some benefits, but restricting screen time quite a lot.
Thank you. Bring in Flick.
Yeah, so looking at the bits which we can control, in February the government issued non-statutory guidance on mobile phone use in school. Are there any plans, or what stage would the department consider making the mobile phone ban statutory?
Well, schools do, take heed of the non-statutory advice that they have, and what we're trying to do here is, first of all, recognising that most schools have restrictions. In fact, probably all schools, I'm sure all schools have some degree of restriction on using mobile phone. Nowhere is it allowable to pull out your phone in the middle of maths and, start doing something. Of course, schools have restrictions. A lot of schools have much more restrictions than that. What we are trying to do is create a new norm. There are many things that we deal with as members of Parliament which are not a problem in the majority of cases, but can still be an issue. And a large part of what we do is deal with those. We want to create a new norm which says that the entirety of the school day, including break and lunchtime, because there is a lot of prevalence of this, of electronica in children's lives, and in adults' lives as well, by the way. We want to make the whole school day free of mobile phones and all that comes with that, the social media and so on, because it's not only about in lesson time, although it is also about making sure there aren't those distractions. And we know from surveys, for example, of children, that children do report there sometimes being such distractions. But also in break and lunch, we want children being with each other, enjoying being children together, and talking and all the, and playing and doing sport and all those sorts of things. So there's never been a pretense that mobile phones aren't already severely restricted in most schools, but we want to create, as I say, this new norm, and I think actually pretty much everybody welcomes there being that norm. And so I'm not anticipating there being a problem implementing this, but if there were, you're quite right, that option remains to make statutory.
How are you monitoring it, and how are you also looking at the impact on the education, which on pupils?
Well, we do have, multiple ways of monitoring. The first, most obvious one is we hear from people. I spend quite a lot of time, officials spend a lot of time talking to head teachers, talking to classroom teachers, and so on. We also, in a more formal way, we also do quantitative research. For example, the National Behaviour Survey asks specific questions about mobile phones and so on. So there are ways of monitoring these things.
Okay, so you haven't got a formal mechanism where you're asking all schools to feed in what they're doing about it?
No.
Okay.
And we wouldn't. That's not normally how we would go about it.
So my colleagues yesterday went to a school where they have these pouches where you put them in and then it magnetically undoes it at the end. And they cost, I think it was in the region of 11 quid.
Yeah.
Is the department going to give any financial help to schools that want to go down that route?
Look, it's up to schools to decide. On this, as on so many things, it's up to schools how to do it, and there are multiple different ways that you can do a phone prohibition. You could have lockers. Obviously. They would be lockable. You can have a locker system, you can have a hand-in system, you can have a not seen, not heard policy. In other words, the bottom of your bag. And the infraction is if it's ever apparent, if ever becomes apparent. Some schools, I think probably quite a small number, do outright bans, including before and after the school day. But it's entirely up to schools how they go about that.
Are there no grants to help them implement the ban in any way from the department?
There are no grants, but there are also ways of doing it that don't involve spending money.
Okay. The other thing is we want the guidance doesn't actually provide a complete list of what exemptions and adaptations can be considered. Should schools assume that exemptions should be only made in exceptional circumstances, such as medical reasons, or should they be more flexible?
So again, we tend not to think that from a building in London SW1 you can kind of account for every situation of every child in every classroom in 22,000 schools across the country. we think that within this new norm, I sometimes use the parallel of school uniform. It is a norm, across our school system that schools will have a uniform. There's lots of benefits for that. But we don't specify, specifically what the policy is on earrings or what the policy is on, individual aspects. Similarly with this, schools know their children. There will be children with certain medical conditions for whom it's important to have access to a device. Of course, in the case of disability, it is a legal duty not to disadvantage those children. But I don't think you couldn't write a good policy document which would cover all of those circumstances. We think it's far better to make schools and make head teachers in charge.
Can I just bring Andrew in? He went to the supplementary.
Yeah, no, I really welcome what you're saying, which relates to what I was going to ask, which is this sort of memento mori effect, I think, of the sort of the slave behind the Roman emperor, whispering in his ear, reminding him that he's human and fallible. That we've got head teachers are being paid over £100,000 a year, and I remember when the sort of school wear guidance came through, I pushed back against it quite a lot because it looked like we were sort of nationalising the school rules. So throughout all of these initiatives and pressure from colleagues and politicians to say, we've banned this, we've stopped this, is there any sort of mechanism within the department other than your own common sense approach to this to sort of remind the department that it's there to help and support schools rather than tell incredibly well qualified and well paid people what to do in minute detail?
Well, may I say, Andrew, look, I understand the point you made, but just, to speak for the officials in the Department for Education, and indeed for ministers, I think one of the things that we all think is most wonderful about the school system is the quality of the people running the schools. And it is absolutely intuitive and natural. I think it comes to officials very naturally to not only to appreciate that, but to realise how fortunate we are and to make absolutely the very best of it, that we end up with a better school system, a better education for children by not thinking we can manage every single detail of schools in some central fashion, but letting all that creativity, all that diversity bloom.
But isn't it the case that some head teachers like to have the rules so they can show parents why, and blame the government rather than
but they do, well. And they do. That is the point.
Exactly.
That's why did we? Why are we doing this? We're doing it because, as I say, it's a new norm.
Yeah.
Head teachers are in charge of their schools, and always have been, and people absolutely recognise that. But this is, as I say, it is adding to that, creating this new norm, but without getting into specifying the micro detail of exactly how you do it, because we are not the best placed people to do that. They are.
So internationally, places like France, Netherlands, etc., have also brought in bans, but they've reported issues with students being able to access digital resources such as timetables when the mobile phone ban was implemented. Has the department considered the impact a mobile phone ban will have on the students' ability to access essential education resources such as timetables?
Well, we have thought about timetables. To be honest, we don't think it is insurmountable to copy out a timetable.
Yeah.
There are bigger questions about, access to digital learning resources and so on. Typically a phone isn't the best way to do that, actually. Typically you need a bigger screen, you need to be able to, the way you sit is different when you're sitting at a computer than if you're using a phone. But on some of the points about timetables and so on, no, of course not. And in setting homework policies, of course, schools will think about how to accommodate all children. That, by the way, doesn't change as a result of the mobile phone prohibition. That's always been something that they've had to think about, and as technology, the prevalence of technology has increased, that's something obviously that has evolved with it.
So you'd expect them all to print out their timetables. I'm just looking, we've got some students behind you, and I'm sure they use their phones to find out where their next lectures are.
That may well be so. I can't speak. I can't speak for them. I think all of us, look, members of Parliament, people working in industry, we've all done things like take photographs of shopping lists that in days gone by we would just have like copied it out. Ian Means hasn't, but everybody else has done something like that. But it doesn't mean we can't copy out the shopping list again in the same way that we used to.
Okay. We've also heard concerns from parents that if children aren't able to take their phone to school, they have no way of communicating with parents in an emergency, for example, during their commute to school.
Yeah.
Do you anticipate that many schools would choose to ban all phones from school premises, or are you really expecting them to put them in the lockers, if you mentioned, or the pouches that we heard about?
So look, those are real concerns that would be real concerns for parents, and I think sometimes there has been occasional misunderstanding about what we're talking about. So the prohibition that we have talked about is during the school day. It's not to and from school. Of course, schools may decide to do something else, something extra, and but I think that would be a minority, but that is absolutely not what we are requiring. And actually, I do absolutely get the point about travel to and from school and so on.
Yeah, particularly when school buses don't turn up.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Robert.
Yes, data from Ofcom shows that nearly a quarter of 12 to 17-year-olds who claim to have strong digital literacy skills are unable to properly identify fake content online. So why are the digital literacy skills of children still poor when digital safety education is being taught in schools?
Look, this is a very important area. Mr. Mears, candidly, digital literacy skills of adults aren't necessarily perfect. And, in a previous job I did, we were looking at online fraud a great deal, which has become the biggest single category of crime. Criminals who sort of go out of their way to find ways to dupe us, to, get into our confidence and so on. There are also people running, the sort of popular culture term is fake news, but it's a bit more sophisticated than that. Running information operations, again designed to rile people and so on. And what we broadly call digital literacy is one way that we help to protect ourselves and others against that. I mean, we're also obviously addressing those things at source, particularly on fraud. For example, there was the Global Fraud Summit yesterday, and obviously on information operations, we expect social media platforms to do more to identify faux and automated accounts and all that sort of thing. But digital literacy is like the last line of defence, and it's incredibly important. And we do more on that in schools than ever we have before. It's part of computing. It's part of citizenship. It's also part indirectly of RSHE. So yes, we are doing more, but it's something that's become a bigger issue in the modern world, and no doubt will continue to grow in salience and importance.
I mean, the department's told the committee in its written evidence that it does not have any specific evidence on the effectiveness of digital safety education. So given what you've just said, and given the low levels of the digital literacy skills of some children, will the department consider reassessing its effectiveness?
Well, we always want to reassess effectiveness, but I think there is also here a role for intuition. So I don't kind of necessarily need a formal assessment of looking at what the outcomes are for children who have learned how to protect themselves online. I know it's an important thing for children to learn how to protect themselves online. Now, obviously, we want to enhance that over time, and you want to learn more about what are the best ways of doing that, but it shouldn't stop us doing it, and we do.
Can I just ask a follow-up on that? I mean, the list of subjects you just responded with in terms of computing, citizenship and RSAG, it strikes me we're having quite a similar conversation.
There is overlap.
There is overlap, but we're having quite a similar conversation to one we had last week about financial education, where an awful lot of content is crowded into subjects on which most secondary pupils do not spend very much time. And to expand on that, we know that computing is a very valuable and useful minority GCSE. It is much more focused on a small group of people than perhaps the old IT one was. Now, I totally recognise the need for changing from one to the other, but it is a smaller category of people who are taking it. Both citizenship and RSHE are engaged with by many students for as little as one lesson a week, or through assemblies rather than necessarily lesson time. And so, is there not a challenge that increasingly important subjects and themes like digital literacy and financial literacy are getting crowded into a smaller and smaller corner of the curriculum when it comes to taught time in secondary school? And is that not something that perhaps needs some long-term strategic thought?
Well, I should say, first of all, it's not only secondary school, and secondly, it's not only about GCSEs. So, as I think we also talked about last week, there is GCSE computer science, that's a growing subject, and I welcome that. But there's also a much, much larger group of children doing computing. They may not take it to GCSE. And by the way, they are also doing it in primary school, where it's very important. And on the point about, these subjects become small parts of, multiple timetable subjects, I guess, Chairman, that there is always an argument. If you have an important topic which is sort of dispersed around different areas of the curriculum, there will always be an argument to say, put it all together in this one thing. But it's also true that when you have everything together in one thing, there's an argument that says, no, you need to weave it throughout the entire curriculum. I mean, I think the important thing is that you do cover these things. And look, we're always open to learning. We're always open to improving. But I think, I think we have got that balance, and we are continuing to evolve. By the way, supported by some fantastic outside organisations, third sector organisations helping on online safety, for example. And so I'm conscious I have spoken so far. I just wanted to just check. Perhaps, Kate, I don't know if you wanted to add anything.
Yeah, I think the point I wanted to make was particularly in relationship, sex and health education, and we're looking at the guidance at the moment, there is definitely the provision for teachers and school staff to be able to respond to what's happening in the school. And actually, a number of the topics in there are things that are evolving very quickly. So actually, I think there is probably more being looked at these issues, which are sort of changing all of the time. I know from my personal experience that every year I'm brought in as the parents of secondary school children to hear what they're going to learn about in the curriculum. There's a massive section on online safety and safeguarding. So I feel quite confident that teachers and school leaders do respond to what's happening. The other point I wanted to make was Oak is looking at its curriculum materials. There is some stuff out there already on computing and on relationship, sex and health education, but the second tranche of that, which they're starting to work on now, and will be available next autumn, we'll have another opportunity to put extra things in and respond to what's been coming up, as well as the new guidance on relationship, sex and health education when that's published.
I think that kind of concerns me about that, though, is that we've also had evidence that quite relatively few teachers who actually teach PSHE or SHE have actually got a relevant qualification in those areas, and the Children's Commissioner has expressed an opinion that a national professional qualification or other relevant qualification on the subject would prove vital in helping teachers to deliver lessons on those subjects much more effectively. I mean, have you got a view on that?
Well, I think having up-to-date knowledge is important, and we do have. There are ways of doing that. On the
but the thing is, Damian, we're expecting schools to deliver those as part of the curriculum, and yet relatively few teachers have actually got a qualification in PSHE or RSHE. So therefore, isn't that something that the department needs to draw its attention to in order to make sure that it's much more effectively delivered across all schools?
Well, but Ian, if we talk about something like online safety, or indeed, I mean, we had a bit of a parallel discussion about related to this on financial education. So if you had somebody who went through teacher training initial teacher training 10 years ago, and had learned all about online safety,
It would be totally
I mean, great, but it's not going to be very relevant today.
But,
I think what we have is good teachers.
No, but it's a starting point upon which professionals, if they have a good programme of continuing professional development, can update themselves. At least they've got a starting point.
Yeah. Well, we do have ways of and good and indeed by some of those third-party programs that I mentioned of helping to keep schools and individual teachers up to date with some of the most recent issues. But I do know. I mean, the most important thing with these subjects is, and you know this, Ian. A good teacher can teach. And I mean, actually, if you talk about a specialist science, for example, there are obviously some things that you really need to have done to higher education level. But if there is new material that comes along that is enhancing what we know about or practice in terms of helping children and young people to protect themselves online, I mean, a good teacher can convey that to those children.
We ran some extra webinars last year on some emerging topics from relationships, sex and health education, and we would certainly think about doing that again with gaps.
I mean, so a webinar is not the be all and end all. I mean, the Children's Commissioner thinks a qualification might be useful. So you don't even consider that.
I've heard her say that before.
Yes,
I think she was a life skills teacher, wasn't she, Rachel? But it's a good question amongst all the other teacher qualifications we've got, and we're promoting.
It's something to contemplate. Anyway, right. How can schools best teach up-to-date digital skills when technology is constantly evolving and, to be fair, old skills are potentially becoming obsolete?
May I bring in Charlotte on that?
Yes, so this is about keeping digital skills up to date in schools. So we published some technical standards for schools in 2019, and as one of the themes within there,
5 years ago.
Yeah. but that was the publish of the strategy, which outlined the standards that we expected schools to follow. And one of those was around continued professional development and ensuring that schools put enough focus within their leadership team on having a single person who is responsible for technology within the school and responsible for making sure that everyone is upskilled. Within my team, I have research teams who spend a lot of time with schools and colleges, actually going out on the front line and finding out what they're doing. On the one hand, we have schools that were a part of our technology demonstrator programme who are very mature in their use of technology in the classroom and are really looking at what the evolution of the learning experience has become as a result of integrated technology. And then we have other schools who, because of their particular community context, have not done that because they know their students, their families best. And we spend time with those schools understanding how they're using technology, what skills they require, and working with them to develop them. We also do a lot of work with technology companies. So I recently attended a roundtable at the Beck conference with Google about how they are developing AI tools for the education sector. And we make sure that we are not just working with the schools, but also with the technology companies to make sure that they are developing best-in-class solutions and products for our education system.
And so, I mean, are you constantly reviewing your 2019 guide?
So it's a framework, and we're constantly reviewing the standards in there. So we have a set of services that underpin that strategy. We have a service called Get Help Buying Tech, where schools can go and log on. I'm responsible for that service, and they can find out about how to procure the best technology, get advice on which technology is best for them. And we have services there around data protection. So we build digital services for all schools to access as well to support them. So they are always evolving.
And I mean, when you look back at that 2019 guidance, do you think it needs to be rewritten or updated in any significant way? I
think the foundations of it still remain, but I think the content underneath them need to be continually reviewed, which we do on an annual basis anyway, as part of our business planning cycles.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you. Ofsted. I don't think we've mentioned that for a while, but Ofsted currently assesses PSHE through the personal development metric, but it's such a broad subject and covers a lot of topics. Is there a danger that by assessing it that way, that's less ideal than doing it through a thematic subject review?
Well, I mean, Ofsted look at personal development. They also look at quality of education, and both obviously are relevant here. Look, I know on we talked a little bit about this last week. There are always kind of arguments for having an Ofsted specifically have Ofsted looking at this aspect of a child's education and report on it separately. And I mean, sometimes those are very good arguments. The problem is if you add them all up, you've got then a completely different system. And as you were alluding to, you're into then changing the balance of individual, autonomy of how you run a school and so on. Ofsted are currently doing a thematic report on personal development, and so I mean we'll wait to see what is in that. But clearly, in this day and age, online safety, RSHE, I mean, these are big aspects of personal development in children, and I would expect to feature significantly.
Well, that's I've written down here: danger of overprescribing teacher knowledge and skills autonomy. Here, I suppose the challenge is, though, that because so many parts of the curriculum are prescribed, that unless you prescribe this bit as well, then people think, I've got to concentrate on the bits that are prescribed because they're my scores. So how within that do we allow for teachers' own particular interest areas and skills to have some space to be communicated to pupils?
Well, the curriculum isn't as prescribed as a lot of people think. I mean, the national curriculum is a framework within which there is quite a lot of scope. But I understand the point you're making. I mean, RSHE is a compulsory subject, not our relationships education and health education in primary, relationships sex education in secondary. Citizenship is a statutory part of the national curriculum in secondary school. And look, in general, I know that schools are in the business of giving children knowledge and skills, right? They're in the business of developing children, helping prepare them for their adult life. Part of which is about the content of the work they'll be doing, but there's many other aspects as well. And in my experience, schools absolutely do not need to be told that it's important for children to learn about these key aspects of life. It's absolutely something they want to do. They want to have the best materials, the best support, and so on to be able to do it.
Just on the point of knowledge and skills, I think we all agree about the importance of both. But one of the processes looking at different parts of the United Kingdom, the Scottish system, sold the great curriculum for skills, and by most accounts, it has not been a great success. No. It has not led to an improvement in attainment. But is there anything we can learn from that? Any positives we can take out of what they've done in the digital space? It would be interesting to know if anyone is monitoring outcomes on that front.
What I would say, and this is an indirect way to address your question, knowledge is important. Knowledge helps you develop skills. It's very difficult to develop skills without any knowledge. And what we see, for example, from the PISA results is that, and of course the PISA tests, because they are effectively the same test run in multiple different countries, different languages, different traditions, certainly different histories, all those kinds of things, they are effectively tests of 21st century skills. But it turns out that jurisdictions that have a knowledge-rich curriculum tend to perform better. And that has been the case if you look at, in the United Kingdom context, England against Scotland or Wales. So just having skills or having modern or having 21st century or whatever it is, having that in the title of something doesn't necessarily mean it's the best way to deliver it. But I fear we are drifting slightly off, perhaps off the core content here. But I think it's
important. But I guess also I just think it's worth having a look to see if there are any aspects, whether it's online safety, digital literacy, and so on and so forth, where actually that approach has helped rather than hindered. I totally accept your analysis of the overall picture, and that is clearly painted out in the PISA scores. But it may be that there are still things we could learn from other jurisdictions where they have taken an approach which is more digitally focused, and that we could pull out some positives. And I guess that's the point I would.
I'm not sure how much more. I would be. I'm always keen to learn from other jurisdictions. I think there's something that in the last decade and a half. We've tried to do extensively at the Department for Education, and where you find something somewhere in the world that works really well, like maths mastery, particularly in some East Asian jurisdictions, pick it up, do it, and that has served us. That has served us well. I'm not sure. I'm going to be more sceptical about saying let's find a jurisdiction which has more digital content in children's lives and see if that has helped them to learn about digital literacy. Following what I said earlier about the precautionary approach, I would struggle to be persuaded that we have a lack of electronica in this country.
Fair enough. Anna,
thank you very much. On to guidance for parents, please, Minister. The Department has previously stated that there is not sufficient evidence to support providing guidance to parents on screen time. However, we've now heard, a lot of evidence as part of this inquiry, including academic experts, who've told us that that should not be a barrier to introducing much-needed guidance. And we heard from Carolyn Bunting, CEO of Internet Matters, that parents are crying out for more support. And indeed, we've heard that from parents themselves on Internet Matters Day in a separate session. So will you commit to commissioning guidance on screen time limits for children from the Chief Medical Officer and other experts?
Of course, I don't speak for the Chief Medical Officer. I mean, you're right indirectly to identify that this is it's a health question. It is also an education question because there are questions about the effect, of course, of computer use on school attainment as well as general child
but on this specific point, if I may, is there any barrier to you as the minister, an educational minister, in asking for that guidance from the Chief Medical Officer?
I don't think there's any barrier to me asking, or us asking of each other all sorts of searching and important questions. I mean, you mentioned who you'd heard from earlier. I think you also heard from Dr. Orban, I believe, who I think was talking about this point I was making earlier about you need to distinguish what it is. It is not one thing. I think she said it's not the screen; it is what is on and around the screen that matters. And
Given the cumulative evidence we've heard, and given some of the risks we're all well aware of, also given, let's face it, we've been through what could be described as a controlled experiment of giving children an awful lot of exposures to digital in their lives, and the outcomes of that in terms of mental health have not been great. Given all of that, isn't there a case, perhaps more than there was 5 or 10 years ago, for actually looking at what is a healthy limit to screen time?
Look, Robin, you won't find me unsympathetic to your analysis, and I'm genuinely not trying to dodge your question. I don't think it has been a controlled experiment, by the way, because this is part of the issue. There is no other country in the world that you can look to and say, well, they haven't had this particular development in handheld technology.
I was thinking more of the pandemic and the period in which we
okay.
left them with devices for their main
communication.
I see,
but I mean, also then, I mean, okay, there were varying effects, but I'm not sure to the extent of having a subject group and a control group. But I think the fundamental point here is that there are two sets of reasons we particularly worry about screen time. The first is about the harms that can come as a result of using technology, but do not have to come from using technology. You know, things like children's exposure to pornography, exposure to self-harm related material, the insecurity that can come for children, for teenagers, from from the sort of quest for likes and popularity, from body image comparisons, and from
Minister, if I may interrupt you, because we're asking questions here, and we have heard a lot of evidence.
No, but I would really like to finish.
Carry on. But by all means, but I want to bring you back to the question, because we've heard a lot of evidence about all of those harms that you have just adumbrated, and we totally obviously agree with them, and that is why we're doing this screen inquiry.
Yes.
There is no duty on the department to have to implement any guidance which it got from the Chief Medical Officer. So there are two processes here. What we are asking at this stage is whether the department would ask for that guidance from the Chief Medical Officer. What happens to that guidance is obviously another question. So can I just ask you, because this is an important question and it's part of our inquiry, and we would very much appreciate if the department would commission that guidance on screen time limits from the Chief Medical Officer.
So I'm not sure now, Anna, what you mean. You mean commission guidance for whom?
For children.
Yeah.
We would like the Chief Medical Officer's opinion on what is a safe level of screen time for children. And that is something which we would then, as part of our inquiry, want to look at and discuss with you, no doubt, at another session.
And I think these are indeed matters that the academic community is rightly concerned with. Earlier on, I talked through some of the research as regards educational outcomes, but there are wider questions. There are wider questions as well. I really would like at some point though to finish answering the question I was answering before, because I think it is really important. So you've asked me specifically, can we have guidance about screen time?
No. I'm asking you, would you please commission guidance from the Chief? Would you ask for guidance from the Chief Medical Officer, which we can then discuss no doubt with you, and decide, and as part of the other evidence as to whether that would then be appropriate for that guidance to be handed on to schools, or whether it would need to be added to, detracted from. It would be part of the evidence that we're gathering.
Okay, so I'm candidly, I'm not sure I quite understand the distinction. I thought you were asking about, shouldn't there be, I mean, regardless of who asked of whom, but shouldn't there be guidance effectively given to parents for how much time children should, or the limit, I suppose, to how much time children should spend online? And I don't, with the point, or the underlying principle at the heart of that, I don't disagree with at all. But what I said right at the start remains true, that even very small amounts of very harmful activity could be just as bad as relatively quite large amounts of, say, educational or pro-social activity. And I think for that reason, trying to come up with the magic number of what's like the limits, I suspect is nigh on impossible. So when you recommend 5 a day fruit or veg, there is no harm can come from somebody eating five a day fruit or vegetables. If you were to say 2 hours a day online is okay, oh boy, there is a lot of harm could come.
Absolutely.
But also there will be many people who will be online for more than 2 hours a day for whom no harm comes. And that is why, and I hope at some point in the session I might be able to come back to this, because I think there are two key groups of reasons we particularly care about screen time. I was about 2/3 of the way through the first one, which was about the direct harms that come. But the second one is about displacement and what happens instead, what is not happening because of being online. So the displacement of sleep is the first thing you hear about sometimes from head teachers, but also displacement of physical activity, sports and games, displacement of interpersonal, and I know sometimes it is a version of interpersonal communication. I think intuitively many of us would say there is a benefit to face-to-face communication and so on. And then there's also kind of distraction, and that can include distraction from schoolwork in or out of school, and all of it in a vicious kind of cycle of reinforcement if there are compulsive or addictive-ish features, design features of these activities. So these are the things that we worry about, the harms that come, the bullying, the exposure to harmful material, and so on. And like as a result of the time spent here, what are children then not doing, which might be a gap both in their education but also in their wider child development.
Which are all well documented health issues.
Yes.
And which are all reasons why guidance from the Chief Medical Officer would be extremely helpful.
Well, with respect, they are all, the first part of what you said is correct. I'm not sure from what I just said it is possible to say, and therefore the correct amount of time limit to have on the internet is X.
No, but
what we can say is...
you can say, therefore it's not a good thing for children to be on devices during their break times at school, which
correct.
You are saying.
Correct. So in the part of the domain which is school, absolutely, and that's why we want to have this new norm. We don't go about telling parents how to bring up their children, but we do emphasise the importance of turning up to school having slept well. We do have an expectation that we should be doing a decent amount of PE a week, and we want children to be doing extra physical activity, including walking or cycling and so on, to and from school, outside of school. And we absolutely need to bear down on those harmful activities and exposure to harmful content. One other thing, may I just say, I realise this turned into in parts, but a long composite, if you like, answer. Ultimately, we want, obviously, it's parents who are in charge, and of course, parents will rightly set rules and boundaries for their children, and the world in which they're doing that has now changed. There were times when people were worried about television. Now, obviously, this is much more, expansive and multifaceted than television, but it's the new thing, the new set of things to worry about. But ultimately, what you really want is for children themselves, as they grow up, obviously they can't do this when they're very young, but as they grow up, to develop their own sense of there is a healthy limit to how much time I will spend online. I want to be doing sport. I want to be face-to-face with my children, my friends, because, of course, there will come a day at 16 or 18 or whatever it is, there will come a day when, they are out into the world.
Right, can I come on now to the next thing? Because I'm working with two parents, both of whom have lost their children, and they both blame to greater and lesser extent online challenges. One is called Holly Dance and one is called Lisa Kenevan. And they are working with Internet Matters. They have highlighted that there is a lack of guidance in primary schools at Year 7 when the children transition from primary to secondary school. They have identified that is the time when, if children don't already have a smartphone, they will get one. And that is the right moment to advise parents of the dangers of the smartphone. Both of their children were in their early teens, just gone to secondary school when they lost their lives. Internet Matters are completely backing their campaign, and they are funding them to make a hard-hitting film to be shown in primary schools. Now, these are two parents in Essex who are leading the way. But what they have proved to me and to other MPs on Internet Safety Day is that there is real inconsistency in the advice which parents get at the end of primary schools in our schools around the country. Now, would you agree that it would be desirable and helpful if we tried to make sure that all primary schools in the country do give parents some advice at that crucial transitioning moment?
And first, let me say, look, I don't know the detail of those two cases, but I'm desperately sorry to hear about them, and there have been too many tragedies from different aspects of what children have been exposed to online. Our thoughts are with those families. I'll let Kate say something on this in a moment, but I mean, I think you highlight, and as you know, as I said at the beginning as well, there does seem to be something about that transition from primary to secondary, and often sort of understandably, because children will be travelling longer distances to school. They will be getting the bus for the first time in some cases. All sorts of things, as well as that point about, well, everybody else is doing it. So it does become a sort of rite of passage. A lot of children will have their device earlier, but those that don't, that does seem to be the moment. And I think that is why it's so important that we have this type of education in primary school as we do. And I know schools do often give such advice, but I'll let to parents as well. But let me bring in Kate.
Thank you. So I think we were talking yesterday about sort of the role between schools and parents, and clearly you're thinking about that as well. There is in two pieces of our guidance a reference to schools talking to parents, perhaps not in the detail these two parents are campaigning for, so it'd be interesting for me to understand a bit more about that. But there's reference in Keeping Children Safe in Education, and there is reference in the guidance that we pulled together, which is about teaching online safety in schools. They both talk about making sure parents are aware of what is being taught in school, but slightly extending that to asking parents to help think about the healthy behaviours and habits translating into being at home as well. I know that my children's secondary school very clearly tell me that it is my phone. I'm funding those phones that are in the hands of my children. It is my responsibility to know what's going on, that I should be creating a culture where I can look on that phone whenever I want. It's not a private thing. So I think there is some way that schools do go to sort of impressing on parents a greater sense of safety and responsibility, but it would be interesting to know a bit more about the detail, particularly at that boundary point.
The question is not around what schools are doing. Schools, all good schools, I'm sure, are doing as much as they can and understand the issues. The question is around consistency, and is the department doing any work to ensure that guidance is being given consistently across the country?
So I guess our mechanisms are Ofsted inspections. We don't have a proactive reporting back against those bits of guidance that flows through.
Sorry to interrupt, because one of the things that we've heard from the Children's Commissioner, and which she's put in her latest report that was published a couple of weeks ago, is that it should be a requirement for Ofsted to specifically be reviewing the guidance to parents on online safety.
It's worth saying, I mean, so keeping children safe in education that Kate referred to, I mean, is the sort of preeminent document, statutory guidance for schools on all things to do with safeguarding, including related to online safety. And if you would, maybe you'd write to me with more detail of the campaign that those families are doing, and I'd very happily, of course, look at it.
With great pleasure. Two very quick ones. Would the department consider providing guidance on a rating system for apps that claim to be educational? So the other end of the telescope.
This is tricky. I'll let Charlotte come in a moment, and I understand why you would ask that, and I totally get the motivation behind it. There is a lot of stuff out there, a lot of material, a lot of choice. There are also quite significant, I'm not going to say barriers, but they are hurdles in doing something like this, because things change so often. And it's not as simple as an age, if you get the PEGI age thing for games, for example, that's relatively straightforward to assess. If you're talking about efficacy of an educational product, that is a much higher bar. So the DFE does not, as a rule, what's the word I'm looking for?
Mandate.
Dictate.
Well, we don't mandate or dictate or
Moderate.
More pain.
whatever the other word is, which may come to me in a moment. We don't kind of kite mark ourselves products, except where there is like a really high standard of proof. So with with educational programs, with phonics, for example, that is in a different bracket. We have the EEF, the Education Endowment Foundation, which exists to evaluate programs to help schools, particularly on Pupil Premium, but actually more broadly as well. It's very relevant how to what to procure, what to focus on. The problem is with some of the ed tech products, by the time you've done that, by the time you've done your randomised control trial, it's a new product on the market, or the existing one has changed like so much. So there are challenges, but I do totally understand. The motivation of what you say, and we'll now hand over to Charlotte.
I think you've covered everything.
Oh, have I? Okay, well.
Very well. I was just going to say there isn't currently a rating system. I don't actually even know whether parents would welcome that at this point anyway. But I know so perhaps that's something we should look into.
We did hear from parents' groups that they would. And I think we also heard concerns that a very high proportion of the quote-unquote edtech products out there on the market, and particularly in the app space, are not educational. Yes. And concerns around direct marketing being delivered through them, and some of these issues as well. So I guess there's a question as to are we comfortable with that space being a complete Wild West, and is there some degree of regulation that might be needed for products that advertise themselves specifically as educational?
So the industry itself has an interest in a bit of self-regulation here, so that people to solidify trust. And there is a thing called EdTech Impact, for example, which is a market-based solution. The other thing to mention is that, often it is, schools are recommending things, and there is also a sense in which you have to be a little bit careful, because just having a high market share doesn't actually make you necessarily a good product. But there is a bit of comfort that people will take, I think, sometimes from having heard from many others that they think, I have to avoid now mentioning individual brand names, but have product X or product Y is a good one. And look, we'll all have come across some of those, big volume things that seem to have a lot of popularity. But ultimately, I think it is the school's own recommendation which is the single most important good housekeeping seal.
Just one final point. We're now moving completely away from the dangers of children who have got too much tech to the other end of the spectrum and the children who don't have any access or enough access to tech for educational purposes. To what extent is the department working to narrow the digital divide that exists for some children and some families?
So during the pandemic, you'll probably be aware that we supplied 1.95 million devices to schools, particularly in the educational investment areas. And we asked schools to basically prioritise where those laptops and tablets, which children were given them. Those devices still exist, and we're working with schools to make sure that they are maintained as appropriately as they can be and kept up to date as best they can. But we give schools autonomy to decide how they invest in technology in their school, and so we don't mandate that. They make that decision, but we do allow Pupil Premium, for example, to be used to spend on buying devices. Now, one of the schools I referred to earlier, which was on our technology demonstrator programme, has a bring your own device policy where every student at the school has to have a device. Now, if they are on free school meal vouchers, for example, the school then rents them a device. So that's how they are approaching that digital, that gap.
So in a nutshell, you're saying that schools are left to their own devices.
Well, but there are devices in schools, is what you're saying,
yes,
to ensure that children have access.
Yes, we have high percentage numbers, evidence of children in secondary schools in particular having access to devices in all schools.
Yeah. So is the issue of the digital divide that was such a worry a good few years ago, is that much less of a worry now for the department?
So when in the Ofcom 2023 survey, 6 out of 10 parents, when asked about whether their child had adequate access to a digital device, in particular to complete homework, so this is outside the school, 6 out of 10 parents felt their child had adequate access. So this isn't necessarily one-on-one device, but this is having adequate access to a shared device for them to be able to appropriately complete homework.
40% is quite a big number not to.
But
It's a lower percentage than 40% in secondary, and within the group that doesn't have, as the survey wording is, consistent access. The next biggest category is they share access with somebody else.
Parents, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, we've sort of covered a lot of this about the digitalisation of education, and we've also talked about displacement of other subjects. Has the department got any plans to ensure that screen-free periods within the school day are protected, or are we allowing the schools, as you've said before, to have autonomy over that?
Schools do have autonomy, but I have to say I've never come across a school that doesn't have screen-free time. Yeah. I would struggle to imagine that any would ever wish to.
Yeah, I mean, I think in Europe, I think Sweden has decided they've got a lack of digital skills, so they've now increased the digitalisation too. But so it's getting that balance right when practically everything now you can do on a screen, apart from maybe physical activities. So
almost anything. I mean, look, here we are talking to each other. And
endlessly picking up our screens.
Call me old-fashioned. Well, sometimes you do go to meetings these days and you do feel like you're just talking to the backs of laptops.
I know, or people with that.
But I do personally think there is still something valuable about having this kind of discussion. And there's something unique about a book. There's something special actually about a newspaper as well.
Which you can get those on your digital devices now.
No, but I'm saying no. What I'm saying is, although there are degrees, aren't there? I mean, there is something very important about news brands that we trust, and including a newspaper brand. But actually, But if you have, sorry, I'm drifting a little bit now away again. But if you've been used to looking at a newspaper on your tablet and you get hold of an actual newspaper again, it's a slightly different experience, and it's a different experience. When you're learning to write, that experience, to come back to education, that experience of making the shapes and so on. That is a different experience from.
Well, there's fairly good evidence cognitively we engage differently with writing something down versus tapping it into a device.
Exactly.
And on which front are we? I mean, I know a number of members of the committee are concerned about proposals for some exams to go online, and should we be, as a system, concerned about the development potentially of online testing? Obviously, the multiplication test, I know, is one that at the early stage, which is designed to be done digitally. But I think they've now started to be the first proposals for GCSEs to be conducted online some years down the track. Is that something you're wholly comfortable with, given those cognitive differences between engagement when it comes to writing on the page and tapping something into a screen, and also all the risks that we're aware of in terms of security, cyber, and so on and so forth when it comes to the use of digital online approaches?
Well, I think, Chairman, you raised some very, very important points. Look, there have always been, or say always, for so long as the technology has been there has been facility for children with certain special educational needs, for example. They should be able to use whatever assistive and adaptive technology is appropriate for them, and that is absolutely right. As regards, I should also, there have been some types of tests which also have long had an online element. If you've done the GMAT, for example, it's a thing you do pretty much entirely, I think actually is entirely online, even the essay is done online. And I do know, obviously, there are arguments in favour of having greater online assessment that can do with, all sorts of things about the assessment itself, but also in terms of efficiency and integrity, security, and so on. I think it's also true that there are, and you've alluded to them, some very important benefits to having the way we have traditionally done written exams. And we will, I know Ofcom are doing some research and analysis at the moment, but these will be very important considerations to have in mind.
Yeah, I just wanted to commend to the Minister and to put on the public record the work of Sam Strickland, the headmaster at Duston School in my constituency, who's written and researched this in some detail and points out the really severe drawbacks, particularly for families with, less access to technology, less household income, etc., of moving away from conventional examination methods. His work on this is quite extensive and well worth looking at.
I will take a look, and thank you, Mr. Lewis.
Thank you. Just on another, perhaps more technical point, we heard evidence that the Online Safety Act specifically doesn't cover EdTech used in school settings. Baroness Kidron told the committee that means a child on the way to school on the bus has more protections than the same child in the school in the classroom. Do you think that criticism stacks up?
Well,
and if not, why not?
Look, max respect to Baroness Kidron, who is a very long and effective campaigner on all these areas around child safety. The reason why the Online Safety Act does not apply in the same way in schools, though, is a different one. It is that there is already a set of statutory requirements around child protection and child safety and safeguarding in schools, and there is already much fuller regime, because it includes in-person inspection by Ofsted. And in formulating the Online Safety Bill as it then was, government was seeking to have a proportionate regime which did not double up on regulatory aspects, but schools are covered in that way. There is a specific point about, and Charlotte may come in at any moment and gently correct me, but around the ICO's age-appropriate design code,
yes.
I think,
yeah.
where there's a bit of unclarity, I think, around how this relates to ed tech products.
Yeah, so we are working with the ICO on the age-appropriate design code to understand how it impacts ed tech. The Dutch government did make some interventions on a similar level with some of the technical products that are being used in schools. So we are in conversations with the ICO around the impact that has on the tech that's being used in our schools. We do, however, have robust outlines in our tech standards around the use of filtering and monitoring, for example, that every school should be using filtering and monitoring software to ensure that they can track everything that a young person is accessing through the school network. And of course that technology in itself is continually evolving, and we're having to keep on top of that and make sure that schools are kept up to date on how they can best manage it. And we have robust cyber security standards as well for schools to follow, which are embedded into the Keeping Children Safe in Education standards. So there are things in place that I believe from a access point of view and content point of view are keeping children safe whilst in school if those standards are adhered to and followed.
Where they're adhered to and followed, and where there's sufficient resource to make sure. And that sort of brings me on to my next question, particularly amongst, we've all discussed how during the pandemic lots of devices were given out to children. There is more hardware of one form or another, both in our schools and across the population than there's probably been ever, at any time before. And yet, for perhaps totally understandable reasons, the department has increased the proportion of school spending on people versus everything else. I think I'm right in saying from about 75% to 82% as part of its guidance. Is there sufficient resource to maintain and keep safe all the hardware across the education piece? And do we need to be having an increasing dialogue actually about the need to maintain and update the hardware and software in order to protect the security of the school estate and children's safety?
Well, I think if the proportion of resourcing going on things other than people, I think if the statistic you just mentioned were going in the other direction, you would rightly have words to say to me, because this is a people business, and machines will never, in education, they play an important role. Hardware and software plays an important role in augmenting and supporting great teaching and learning, but will never replace the brilliance, the inspiration of a great teacher standing at the front of the class. I'm not sure your question is entirely answerable, because any question is like, is there enough? Yeah. Can always be answered by, well, there should be more. But we do have accumulated expertise now in managing hardware. We do have the guidance that goes out to schools, but I should probably let Charlotte pick up.
So things like Connect the Classroom, which was our rollout of improving connectivity of schools and now rollout of fibre. We have Get Help with Buying Tech for Schools. All of these different initiatives were born from actually different areas of the department. They've now all been brought together into a single digital data technology strategy, which I'm solely responsible for. That's been a recent change, so that we can ensure we are able to make a holistic set of priorities against everything we need to do for the sector. We believe actually by doing that we'll be able to drive efficiencies in the way that we deliver it. So I don't have a specific answer around whether we need more, but I think we are approaching things in a more effective and efficient way for the future that I feel more confident about. And
you've mentioned a number of times the late lamented or unlamented, depending on who you ask, EdTech demonstrator programme.
Oh, yes, which is now stopped. Indeed. But has been replaced with a blueprint programme, which we're trialling in Blackpool and Portsmouth. So it's evolved. Okay. And we still stay in contact with those demonstrator schools because they were sort of spearheading the way in terms of how technology could be used in the learning environment.
But in terms of the ongoing work on that, that's 2 specific pilots you mentioned. But is that as part of the education investment area?
Yes,
program?
that's right. Yes, it is. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
But in terms of the scale, I mean, it's striking. I mean, Flick mentioned Sweden earlier. I think they had a sort of bit of a U-turn in terms of their digital strategy and a move away from moving exams online, for instance, recently, as part of a recognition of some of the challenges of going too far, too fast down the digital route. And again, I was just very struck in the conversations we had from UNESCO that they had gone from being an organisation which had very much been promoting and driving the uptake of technology, particularly in the developing world, to one which was beginning to sound some notes of warning about both the amount of digital wastage going on and of the sustainability of running costs being taken on in that space, as well as some of these issues around risk, distraction, mental health, and other issues. So I think it's interesting to note how that dialogue seems to be changing on the international level. And I guess that's something that needs to be closely followed by the Department for Education and any work that we're doing in this space, recognising that we all want the UK to be a leader in digital skills and digital technology. So striking the right balance here strikes me as a very important part of all of our jobs. But with that, Minister, I think we can say we are done. Order.
Very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
The proceeding has ended. 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 The proceeding has ended.